I'm making one video for every day in July, and this is the third video. For the first two videos, I didn't really have much of a plan, so I just read you some things that I liked. For this, the third video, I have 5 minutes worth of plan, and it relates to what I do by day, which is I run a civic school called Maximum New York, and I teach people how New York City, New York State, and the federal government work. But the centerpiece is really New York City with its dependencies at the state and federal level. And often people ask, well, maybe I can't take your class, but how could I learn how the New York City, maybe New York State governments work? And the first thing I'll say is, as an autodidactic task, like all autodidactic tasks, it's difficult and you really have to be cut out for it. But if that's you, then I'm just going to introduce you to 5 different kinds of books that could really help you. And these 5 categories are not the end all be all. I made the categories up like 7 minutes ago, but it will give you a little bit of the lay of the land. So the first kind of book is an administrative history. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's written by administrators of some kind. So local government handbook written by the Division of Local Government Services, which is a subdivision of New York State's Department of State. So this book will give you an overview of all the different kinds of local government, counties, cities, towns, villages, etc., and more in New York State. And there are often special overviews of New York City specifically, since it's so atypical and is about half the state itself. Another example of that relevant to New York City is this history of New York City's Rent Guidelines Board and our rent regulation system. So rent regulation, notoriously confusing, tons of technical terms that people conflate and get confused, but the Rent Guidelines Board staff put together this lovely history of how that whole system, which is about half of our rental stock, about 1 million units, works. So you can just read this, and you don't even have to read all of it. There are appendices here that take up a lot of space. Really, there's a core few tens of pages that you could read. All right, so those are examples of the first kind of book, which is an administrative history of some kind. The next kind of book is a case text, like this one, local government law. Typically, most people would only encounter case texts in law school, and they don't really have a reputation of being enjoyable. But if you are an autodidact and you love government, why, this can be your bedtime reading, like it was mine once upon a time. I really like this book. There's a lot here. You don't have to read it cover to cover. You can dip in and out based on what you find interesting in the table of contents, but case texts are very underrated. And they're not just for law students. I will say though, buy a used one or go to a library and get one, because otherwise they are quite expensive. Okay, what's the third kind of book? The third kind of book is a reference compilation usually put together by a librarian. The New York Legal Research Guide. This thing is a lifesaver. I think it's probably the single most useful book, if I had to pick one, for just a raw technical understanding of how the New York City and state governments work. I don't know if you can see super well the table of contents. I'll link a copy, but Chapter 1, New York's constitutions. Chapter 2, state legislation, legislative process, bills, resolutions, and sessional laws. Chapter 3, state legislation, revisions, and compilations of New York legislation from 1638 to 1906. I mean, it goes on and then gives you very detailed overviews of New York City's government and its law specifically too. So, God bless librarians. Okay, that was book 3. The fourth kind of book is a book that is produced by an academic press, usually one in New York City or New York State, that's about New York City, New York State government. So 2 examples: Governing Gotham by Nick Berg, and this is produced by Rutgers University Press. And New York Politics, A Tale of Two States, and this one is produced by Cornell University Press. So there are also books that are produced by the state university and city university system. But the academic press books are usually written, well, by academics who have a particular angle on how things work. I mean, this book, though, is also written by practitioners and people who work in the state legislature, too. So that's academic press books. There's a lot more of these. The fifth kind of book is actually a very broad category, and I smushed a lot of stuff into it. I call it the "they were there and they did the thing" type books. So Michael Bloomberg's Department of Transportation commissioner wrote Street Fight, so you can figure out how we got City Bike and so much more. She talks about what she did. Or you could read a recent book, one of my favorites, I'm still working on a book review of. Peter Moskos wrote Back from the Brink, Inside the NYPD and New York City's Extraordinary 1990s Crime Drop. And it's a lot of interviews with the people who were there, worked in the NYPD, saw the crime drop, made the crime drop happen. Great book. So unlike the first one, that's the person who did the thing talking about it. This book is a very well-researched set of interviews with people who did the thing. Another example is Robin Nagel wrote this book, Picking Up. She's an anthropologist, but she embedded herself in the New York City Sanitation Department and actually did the job, and then wrote this history of sanitation in New York City based on her academic experience, but also her actual real world experience over a long period of time in the Department of Sanitation. Two more examples of the "they were there," the fifth kind of book. George Waring, he was the commissioner of sanitation before it was called the Department of Sanitation, prior to New York City being consolidated in 1898. If you know anything about New York City, then you probably know about him. He is extraordinarily famous for being extremely effective at his job and solving New York City's terrible sanitation and trash problems right at the end of the 19th century. So this is just him writing about how he did it from his perspective. And that is different than Street Fight, because Street Fight's very recent. But keep in mind, people who operated more than 100 years ago, they wrote about how they did things too, and those are also useful perspectives. Another example of the fifth kind of book, that "they were there, they did the thing," Learning to Govern: My Life in New York Politics from Hellgate to City Hall by Peter Vallone, who was a titan of latter 20th century New York City politics and was the first speaker of the council after the fall of the Board of Estimate, for those of you who know about that story. And he just talks about how he got into politics and some nice vignettes about wielding power and getting big things done in New York City government at the end, for the most part, about the last quarter of the 20th century. So the 5 kinds of books that an autodidact can pick up to get a good impression of how the New York City and New York State government work. We have administrative histories that are written by people in the guts of government itself. We have case texts, number 2, which you typically would only get if you were a law student, but anyone's allowed to buy them and read them. 3, reference compilations, usually created by librarians, God bless them. 4th, academic press books. There are a lot of these. And then the 5th one is a very broad category, the "they did the thing" books. And maybe those books are by people who actually did the thing. Maybe it's sets of interviews done by someone who's interviewing people who did the thing, and maybe it's a giant mix of those. So those are your 5 kinds of books if you want to autodidactically dive into New York City and state. But these exist for other states, other cities, and the federal government too. And there's also more than 5 categories. I'm just making a quick video.